This is a servo motor. A servo motor only spins 180 degrees. A servo motor will not spin 360 degrees. It goes back and forth across the same platform over and over again. When coding and building a servo motor, there are 3 wires. The wires are different colors for different servo motors, but there's one wire that is ground or negative, one wire that is positive, and the other wire that needs to connect to a digital pin. Specifically, a digital pin that has a squiggly line next to it, or a PWM pin, because the servo motor requires a different way that the electricity flows through it. So it has to go through a PWM pin. So what you're going to do is you're going to connect the ground to the negative side of the breadboard. If the negative side of the breadboard is connected to the ground in the Arduino, you're going to connect the positive side of the servo motor, the positive wire, to the positive side of the breadboard. And then you're going to connect the other wire, the one that needs to go to the digital pin, to any digital pin that has a squiggly line next to it. So I'm going to put it in number 6. You can also skip the breadboard if you want to, if it's feasible for you, if you're only coding one thing, and connect these 2 right into these pins if you want to, if it works for you.
Alright, so today we are going to be learning how to code a servo motor. As always, we want to begin our code with a loop. So the loop can be found under the Control tab on the left. And since we're using a servo, the angle of the servo motor just keeps changing. So the next thing we want to do is create a variable that stores these angle values. So you can find the variable block under the Numbers and Constants tab, and it's called the Set Number Variable block. So we want to drag that in. And we want to name this variable servo, which is the simplest thing you can name it. If you have multiple servos connected to your Arduino, you might want to name it servo1 so you don't get confused, but in this case we are only using one servo, so we're just going to name it servo. And the value of the variable corresponds to the angle of the servo motor. So since the servo starts off at an angle of 0, we want our variable value to start off at 0 as well. The next thing we want to put into our loop is a repeat block. So those repeat blocks can be found under Control as well, and it's the last one here. As you can see, at the top of each repeat block there is a number. Here it's 5, and this number represents the amount of times you want the code to be repeated. So basically a repeat is like a loop block, but it will only repeat the code however many times you tell it to, unlike a loop block that will actually repeat infinitely. And since servos only turn 180 degrees, we want this repeat block to actually repeat 180 times so that it spins that full 180 degree range. So I'm going to change this 5 here into 180. Inside the loop, we want the angle of the servo to change so that the servo will actually turn. To do that, we need to go back and use our servo variable again. So we want to increase that servo variable by 1 degree so that it will turn. And so we need to get another set number variable block. So if you remember, that's found under the Numbers and Constants block, and it's the set number variable, so we want to drag that in there. We want this variable name to match the variable that we created earlier, so we're going to name this servo. And we want to make the value servo plus 1, because the servo is actually a number that's representing the angle of the servo, so we can do math on it. So to do that, we want to go into Operators and find the block that looks like a plus sign, which is this one over here. So I'm just going to move this 0 and drag that in. To get the block that says servo, you need to go into Numbers and Constants and get the number var name, and you can just write, drag it in, you can just change this to servo. And to get the number, you just go back into Numbers and Constants, and you can drag that 1 in there. The last thing we want to do is set the servo variable, which represents the servo's angle, to the angle of the actual servo. So we need to get a servo block, which can be found under the Pins tab. This one here. So the number at the top, you want it to match the pin that you connected your servo into. So before we had connected our servo into pin number 6, so I'm going to change this to number 6. But it could be any of the pins that you connected your servo to. And we want the angle here to just be the variable servo. So go to numbers and constants, get the number var name, and change it to servo. Lastly, we want to add a delay of 10 milliseconds because all this goes very quickly, so we want the servo to have time to actually turn. So the delay can be found under utilities and delay in milliseconds. So I'm just going to change this to 10. Now, since a servo only turns 180 degrees, but we actually want it to turn 360, we need another repeat block so that this code will repeat a total of 360 times, which will correspond to 360 degrees. So you can just right-click so you can clone this code here. We want to do everything the same as before, except this time the servo is going to turn back around because it can't turn that 360 degrees, it can only turn 180. So to do that, all we need to do is change how the value of servo is changing. Instead of it increasing, we actually want it to decrease. So to put that into coding terms, we need to use a subtraction block instead of the addition block that we used before. So do you see this little down arrow that appears when you hover over the plus sign? You can just change that into the minus sign and you're good to go. Actually, you need to change the delay here. After you do that step, you're done. So the code should turn your servo. So save and upload your code to test it out.